Welcome, everyone, to today's panel for the Free Up Agenda 2025 conference. For those of you who have not joined us previously, the Agenda 2025 conference is our daily series through November, where we are looking at how to develop a bipartisan agenda around equal opportunity and free enterprise for the next president who comes into office, not in 2021, but in 2025. Can we work together over the next 4 years to build that agenda? And today, we have an incredible group of people who are not only eminent on this question of how to blend free enterprise and equal opportunity, but what I really appreciate about all of them is how original their thinking is and how creative their thinking is on this issue. I know you will all learn a lot. If you don't already know these individuals, we're joined by Zach Karabell, who's on the board of New America and founder of the Progress Network, a group that tries to bring people of both parties together to show how actually we're doing better than you might think in a lot of areas of our economy and politics and policy. Reihan Salam is the Manhattan Institute president, and actually Reihan and I first got to know each other when he had a blog at National Review called The Agenda, so it's fitting that he's here for this conference. And Scott Winship, who was a colleague of mine, both at the Manhattan Institute when we were both there and at Free Up, where he was our first visiting fellow, and is now at the American Enterprise Institute, where he runs the Poverty Center at the AEI, and was just previously before that the executive director of the U.S. Congress Joint Economic Committee, where he did a lot of really important work on social capital. Well, let me kick it off this way, guys, and any of you can take this. And by the way, before I do that, actually, let me just say to the audience, if you want questions, we want to make this as interactive as possible. You can tweet us using the hashtag #Agenda2025, hashtag Agenda2025, or you can click on the Q&A box here on Zoom and type your question in there. And we'll be going to Q&A basically after these opening set of comments. So I'm going to just throw it out to whoever wants to jump in on the question of, look, we have this election. It looks like Biden is going to be the next president. It's pretty likely that McConnell will still be the majority leader. We don't know that for sure, of course, because of the Georgia runoff, but that seems like the most likely outcome. What are some of the things that you are hoping or believing that could get done in this period of time where Biden and McConnell could work something out? Are there ideas that you have that you would either like to pitch them on or you believe they will actually take up?
Well, just very briefly, just to state the obvious, you have a Democratic coalition where you had a number of very ambitious policy thinkers who were hoping to really transform a wide range of safety net programs, to transform the tax code in a very ambitious way. They had to calibrate the fact that they have a coalition that is a diverse coalition, including a coalition that is increasingly dependent on upper middle income, affluent households, not just as an electoral base, but also as a donor base. And that was a kind of complicating factor. And now just those plans are very much up in the air. You also had this broad consensus, and Zach and Scott might disagree with me on this, but I'd say that it's a broad consensus that we are not going to raise broad-based taxes of the kind you see in the social democracies of Northern Europe. Rather, we are going to have very narrowly targeted tax increases, and we are going to introduce some new safety net programs, for example, parental leave programs, other things that are broadly popular. We are going to engage in deficit spending when it comes to projects like the Green New Deal, infrastructure-related spending, et cetera. And perhaps we will talk about broad-based taxation in the future. But the idea here was to try to reconcile the desire to reduce poverty through, for example, large child allowances and various other measures that have really gained a lot of currency throughout the Trump years on the Democratic side. And just all of this is just not likely to happen if you have a Republican majority leader. So then you are talking about executive action. You're talking about regulations. You're talking about a different set of levers. Maybe if you have a narrow Democratic majority, you're able to get reconciliation instructions. You're able to get something on the tax and spend side. But it just seems like you're going to have a very, very constrained administration. So when it comes to the kind of left, center, left mobility agenda, it's very hard for me to see dramatic progress in the next year or two.
Zach, what's your perspective on that? You're coming at it from, you have a network that has a lot of left to center people in it. What do you think?
So, I mean, it would be hard to disagree with Reihan. First of all, it's usually hard to disagree with Reihan, but it would be hard to disagree with Reihan about the limitations that a Biden administration is going to face with a McConnell-led Republican Senate. Mitch McConnell, whatever one thinks about him, is extraordinarily adept at maintaining his caucus and obstructing things that he thinks should not happen. So that's going to be a massive check on a whole slew of programs. I don't know that it'll be a massive check on significant spending for a stimulus bill. I mean, it's not going to look like what Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic caucus wanted it to be, and even frankly, what Donald Trump might have agreed to had he been reelected. The irony being, the United States could actually be facing less stimulus with a Biden president, a Republican Senate, and a Democratic House than it would had Trump been reelected. But that's neither here nor there. Meaning it's the reality we're in. I am very much of a mind in all of this in a way that one's not supposed to be when asked to oracularly look at a crystal ball about the future. That predictions right now about what's going to happen are unusually fraught with uncertainties. I try to approach everything in these moments, particularly in COVID land, with an even higher bar of humility about just not only the known unknowns, but the unknown unknowns, so that I do think that I'm not as comfortable really having a sense of how this is all going to play out. I mean, I think there are things you can assume about a Biden administration, its composition, its tenor, but how that plays out politically and what the arc of COVID is relative to its effects on economic life and what pressures that put on Republicans and Democrats to do things that they might either otherwise not do, like compromise or spend or tax. I think that's really difficult to say. But the sweeping program that was lining up, had there been three branches of government under the same control, that seems completely untenable, right? So it's hard to see a pathway where any of that happens. Beyond that, it's then a question of like what the pathway would be. And other than a degree of stimulus, right? I don't believe Washington or the Republicans would allow for an economic implosion, right? I think what we learned from April was that in a really sinking ship scenario, there will be action. But in a scenario, and I'll finish up and Scott should go on, in a scenario where there's no consensus about what part or how much of the ship is sinking, I think that can get quite complicated, right? The recent unemployment report that came out today, unemployment is 5+% in Kentucky, and it's 12 to 14% in New York City, and it's 11% in California, and it's 3% in North Dakota. When you have that kind of disparity, somebody's got to recognize that we're in this together, and that it's not purely your problem, which we do when there's a hurricane, right? If when a hurricane hits Houston or the Gulf Coast, there's some grumbling, but people don't essentially say we're not going to spend emergency aid to rebuild because it's your responsibility because you built in a floodplain. But there's a danger of some of that going on about subsequent stimulus because of the differential economic effects of the pandemic, let alone the differential class and race effects of who's getting hit hardest by the pandemic.
Scott, what do you think? What do you think is our opportunities for collaboration, bipartisan collaboration?
Thanks, Avik. First, I want to say, for purposes of the electoral vote, I'm claiming the entire rest of the panel for myself, just to start off. Kidding, of course. So I actually think there may be a couple of opportunities. First and foremost, the most important thing to do to ensure that we've got opportunities moving forward, priorities 1 through 5 have got to be getting the coronavirus under control. There's a few different ways you could do that. We could experiment with sending kids back to school. As Avik, you've argued forcefully for, we could do some sort of massive testing program, which is kind of more where I fall down. What we can't do is just sort of keep muddling through like what we're doing. Some research by an organization called Curriculum Associates found that between 20 and 50%, the number of second and third graders who are behind a grade this fall is 20 to 50% higher than it was this time last year. There's also great research by Raj Chetty and his team at Opportunity Insights that showed that after the lockdown, online math learning, between rich kids and poor kids, or that lived in rich areas and poor areas, diverged dramatically. So the lockdown has really taken a toll on opportunity, I think. So I think the Democrats would love to pass a multi-trillion-dollar bill, that gives a little bit for a lot of different groups. It probably will have to be winnowed back for Mitch McConnell's Senate to do anything. But I think it would be smart to at least invest a whole lot more into testing than what we've done so far. And it's probably worth also shoring up the safety net a little bit. I don't think that is necessarily going to address this issue of opportunity per se. We've got to get the schools open, and to do that, I think ultimately we've just got to get people feeling safer going about their business. The other places where there could be some opportunity, Reihan mentioned child allowances. I guess I'm more bullish. I don't personally love child allowances for purposes of expanding opportunity, but I do think there's a decent shot that we'll get something like that, just because there are a lot of pronatalist Republicans out there who are interested in sort of giving parents more money so that they can have more kids to the extent that they can't afford to right now.
Like a child tax credit, or is a child allowance different from a child tax credit?
Well, essentially what the Democrats were talking about, or have been talking about, what the Biden campaign has been talking about, is expanding the child tax credit in various ways so that essentially it would be a child allowance for everybody under $400,000, something like that. And I think that is possible that passes. The other area that I would keep my eye on maybe is in housing policy. The Biden campaign has wanted to expand housing vouchers dramatically. I don't see anything like that happening, but maybe a smaller expansion of housing vouchers that is tied to some research that, again, the Chetty team has put out there, which is that if you encourage people to move to high opportunity areas, that has pretty strong results. And so maybe we can pair expanded housing vouchers with some additional requirements on it. Also, I think there could be some interesting things around affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is sort of a regulatory thing that the Biden administration could do on its own. Maybe Republicans can influence that so that's not quite as bad as what the Obama administration was talking about doing, but that is more like what Secretary Carson has been talking about doing, at least until the last few months of the campaign, when we decided we were going to scare suburbanites. But that would essentially provide more opportunities for poor families to live in the suburbs by creating incentives to change zoning laws. So that could be another area where maybe we can see something happen.
There are other people who
go ahead.
Who
go
will
ahead,
be
Ryan,
more
please.
insightful on the particular question of how a majority leader McConnell would approach things. But my general sense is that he does not want to divide his conference. So even if you have a small number of Republicans who might be willing to defect on this or that issue, he would be very reluctant to move forward on those grounds alone. And I think that that's something to bear in mind. And if you have a very narrow 50-50 outcome, let's say, in which you have Vice President Kamala Harris, in case that's how things play out, as the tiebreaker, even in that instance, you're going to have a number of vulnerable Democratic senators who are going to be looking to 2022. They're going to be thinking hard about whether or not it's wise and appropriate for them to embrace aggressively redistributionist new programs. So that's one reason why I think that the opportunities are few and far between. You will have a number of tax provisions in the TCJA that will come to an end at the end of 2021. That could create some leverage, that could create some opportunity for some kind of bargain. But then again, you could let things just expire and then use that as a talking point for re-election. So, though I think, all of us would want there to be room for meaningful bipartisan cooperation on some of these issues. I think that even if you're thinking about housing vouchers, that's an idea that a lot of folks on the right, a lot of market-oriented thinkers are more inclined to embrace than rigid rent controls, for example. But when you're looking at, and this was a consensus view among Democratic presidential candidates, when you're looking at these proposals for universal housing vouchers, this really is, and Scott will have more to say about this, but in a way, it's almost like bringing back AFDC, because you're bringing back housing vouchers as an entitlement. And you're also introducing a very steep cliff when it comes to earnings, very high implicit marginal tax rates for people at low levels of income. So, there may well be some good outcomes that would stem from this, but it's something that could create serious issues for people who are looking to climb the economic ladder. And I think that's not something that a lot of folks in the center left have thought deeply enough about, the actual ways that that program would interact with various other safety net benefits. So, but again, that's a debate that I think is going to be deferred for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, there's one other.
Go ahead, Zach.
There's one other X factor here, which is that if the Supreme Court rules between now and Election Day that by doing away with the tax that requires enrollment has invalidated the entire Affordable Care Act, oddly enough, the effect of that might be, and probably would be, to force both Congress and the White House to craft legislation to fix the problem, right? This is not one of these situations where anything could just like revert to the status quo ante before the Affordable Care Act. So, in a way that I think would rather backfire on a lot of the conservatives who've been fulminating against the act and hoping for a repeal at this stage would actually force legislation. It would not be a tenable situation to have no governing legislation for a healthcare system that is largely ungovernable. I don't know what you guys feel about that, but my take is that that's not an area where there is any actual agreement or bipartisanship, but it is one where, kind of like the emergency of COVID, the simple reality of a cliff could force working together to cobble together something that is almost certainly likely to be better than the situation that we have right now.
I was going to say, we through this series, the Agenda 2025 series, we'll have a panel on just that topic on the healthcare side on next Friday, 1 week from today, on Friday, November 13th, and we have a housing panel on Wednesday, November 18th. So we will stay tuned for both of those for more detailed discussion of those two.
But wait, there's more.
There's more. But the thing I wanted to add, the one theme that we've touched on, all of you, in some form or another, is this point about COVID, the stimulus, a potential stimulus. And we talked about this in the kind of the preview for this panel, and the way we pitched it to the audience here. Do we believe that that once we get through COVID, the economy is going to snap back, or are there going to be durable effects in terms of economic inequality from COVID? One possibility is, of course, schools, but I don't want to prejudice your answer. You tell me where you're concerned that there's going to be durable impacts from this pandemic.
Well, just to elaborate on the schools point, I think there's no question that when you have significant learning deficits over a prolonged period of time, you will have durable learning loss. And that's something that, there is some good suggestive evidence that can have a compounding effect over time and on not just educational, but on labor market outcomes. So that's certainly something for us to be mindful of. And as you suggested earlier on, as both you and Scott suggested earlier on, these are learning deficits that have been very uneven across the population, across demographic groups. And I think that that's absolutely reason for concern. This is slightly tangential, but another thing to note is that, when it comes to this, ongoing debate over school reopening and what have you, one issue is the response of school districts and public employees, but another issue is the response you're getting from parents. There are many parents working parents, lower middle class parents who are quite cautious. They're quite anxious about the prospect of returning, having their children return to school. So you have this tension where the exact families where you don't necessarily have the resources to provide that kind of in-home stimulation and care that can guard against learning loss are oftentimes the very same families that are most anxious about returning. So there is a little bit of a tension there where it's kind of culture interacting with policy in a way that's frankly very difficult to address in a straightforward way. So I think that that's a big one. And another big abstract question is whether or not we're going to see a really durable shift in work patterns. When you're looking at some of the metropolitan regions that have been big drivers of productivity gains across the economy, where you've seen a real concentration of skilled talent, those are also places where you've seen a big expansion of in-person services. Both Scott and Zach were referencing this basically. That's one reason why you have some very urbanized parts of the country that were doing particularly well during the Trump years and now have done particularly poorly in the wake of COVID. You just have a more services-oriented economy. And that service-oriented economy is driven in no small part by people with more modest levels of educational attainment. And so, you have this connection. Avik, you were referencing the challenge of the kids, but then it's a two-generation issue, right? Because it's also the parents who are exactly the ones where, what are jobs that can't be automated? What are jobs that are high touch? And if you really do see some meaningful change here, that's going to be something that is going to raise a lot of questions about, what is the kind of other thing that fills the breach when you have this kind of labor market polarization. Now, I actually believe, I'm somewhat bullish on the idea that in-person services will hold up and that you will see some return to normalcy. You'll see some shifts at the margin, but again, you'll see people moving to different communities potentially. I also don't think that's going to happen in enormous numbers, by the way, but that's also going to create opportunities for other metropolitan regions potentially. So overall, I don't expect some drastic change, but one thing we know, and one thing that I know Scott can speak to very well, is that these seemingly short-term perturbations can have very durable, long-term compounding effects.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are a couple different potential problems. One is like the sort of little kids or K through 12 problem, and another is kind of the higher ed problem. We may actually get weird randomized or natural experiment in a way. There's this debate about how much people actually learn in college versus whether it's just an important credential to have. We're probably going to get a lot of people that that leave with a credential that maybe haven't learned as much as they normally would have, and it'll be interesting to see whether that impacts their short or long-term employment outcomes as well. So yeah, I'm definitely worried about kind of a one-time opportunity shock for the kids going through. Of course, it's an entire generation going through it. They're just going through it at slightly different ages. So is it going to hurt the first graders, that have been through it, or is it going to hurt the 10th graders that have been through it, or is it going to hurt the college juniors that have been through it? We don't have answers to those sorts of questions. But it's disruptive to a trend that at least didn't seem like it was going in the wrong direction beforehand. There were a number of studies that were indicating that the gap in learning between high SES kids and low SES kids, was not narrowing, but it wasn't getting worse over recent decades. I think that trend probably is going to look worse moving forward.
I mean, on the sheer question of inequality, which I think everybody here and most people listening probably know, whether it's the United States or almost everywhere else in the world outside of East Asia, the pandemic and the economic effects of the attempts of various governments to contain it have been, terrible for inequality, and in terms of widening it and setting things back. That is just unequivocal. From who has suffered the most in terms of health effects, and again, that's not a U.S. specific reality. It's minorities, aged, whatever, in every country. Millions of people in India thrown back from tenuous early steps into lower middle class to, back to where they might have been 10 or 15 years ago. Working class in the United States, often urban oriented, who simultaneously have been non-discussed as such essential workers, right? That was in April and May. Fine for knowledge workers / office workers to go virtual, but you still needed hundreds of thousands of people, manning the urban infrastructure and food and all that to make it possible for everybody else to be locked up, right? I mean, there's no such thing as an actual lockdown. It's more of a, 75-25 lockdown or 80-20 lockdown. So, that is a massive effect. I think the question, and kind of gets to what Reihan had talked about and your question, Avik, is like, what is the alacrity of the snapback? And again, back to my earlier point about the humility, we won't know that till we know that. It's relatively easy to forecast a situation where we have literally been shunted into a different groove societally and globally. Deglobalization, years of duress, nobody going to offices, virtualization of school. It's also entirely possible that we're overstating the likelihood of that because that's our contemporary reality, and human beings have a chronic tendency to extrapolate from their contemporary reality forward, no matter what that contemporary reality is. So a year ago, urbanization is continuing around the world. It's an economic growth. Now urbanization is dead. Everybody's going to move to Boise. Isn't it great to be in the Adirondacks? I have my own pet theory about the tenability of Zoom work life extended forward. And I mean this simultaneously tongue in cheek and totally seriously. Everything happened in the United States and in the Northern Hemisphere almost coincidental with the beginning of spring. And it's very different for people to flee upstate New York, into Tahoe, into Saginaw, Michigan, or the suburbs of various places, or to go and move in with their parents in a house somewhere in the country at a time when everybody's like, wow, I've been spending all my time in the office and now I can walk around the lake and it's really relaxing and it's beautiful. That same equation when there's 7.5 hours or 8 hours of sunlight and it's 37 degrees and there's freezing rain and your power goes out and you can't get your car to your driveway, it becomes a radically different experience of what it is to be, in one place versus the other. So let's give the kind of the Zoom life a regular winter before we conclude that everybody is totally content to live this way. But the inequality thing is a real problem.
One question we got, and by the way, as a reminder to the audience, if you want to ask questions, hashtag Agenda 2025 on Twitter, or you can go to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a general problem with cost of living. Reihan, you work in Manhattan Institute is historically focused on and under your leadership focused on urban policy, in particular free enterprise as it relates to urban policy. Rising cost of living is a huge problem and an increasing and growing problem in particular cities, whether it's healthcare, which is a national problem, or housing, which is a problem that's particularly being experienced by certain cities. Energy costs are going up, particularly as we think about climate policy. How should we think about cost of living in the context of a 2025 agenda? What are the areas that you're most worried about, and what are the policy opportunities for reform to address the rising cost of living?
This is a domain that is very thorny because it really is about the intersection between policy at the federal, state, and local levels. And it's also about basically the regulatory environment and the kind of complicated interaction between different levels of government. One larger issue that has bearing on this is that we live in a moment of intensely nationalized politics. So you might have one set of views when it comes to the cost of living, a cost of living that is determined in no small part by policies that are happening at the local level. And yet you might vote in response to your views on national issues, your social identity, and what have you. And so that makes things really, really challenging. You have people who might be social conservatives but who also happen to favor very restrictive regulations at the local level that might increase the cost of living. Vice versa, you might have people who are liberal on social issues, but basically you don't have the kind of right sorting. And you also don't have the right visibility. There are issues that have big, deep, durable effects on economic outcomes, on the cost of living, yet which really, the kind of policy levers that are in Congress's hands can't really move them all that much. And so what you get because of this intense nationalization of politics is you see lawmakers at the federal level who debate various measures where really they can only have a kind of structuring effect. So, well, and that's at best. Either it's going to be chiefly symbolic legislation at that level, or it's going to be something where you're going to create some kind of race to the top. You're going to create some new conditional federalism program, something along those lines, some incentive program, some matching grants, something along those lines to kind of compel some policy response at the state and local level. So I think that that's a huge, huge problem. Cost of living is a huge issue. There are fairly straightforward things we can do to mitigate some of those problems. But those are things that have to be driven by policy entrepreneurship at the state and local level more often than not. And that's just something where there's a real dearth of activity. There's also a real brain drain from state legislatures, from local governments, partly because of this intense focus on national politics. Again, this isn't all about policy. It's all about creating room for entrepreneurs to solve problems that can help address the cost of living. I think that's really important, and that's an area where federal policy can make a difference. But part of this is that people just aren't paying enough attention to really bad decisions that are being made at the state and local level.
Anyone else want to jump on that before we go to the next question?
Scott, you want to get in first?
I'd agree with all that. I think, there are things that federal policy can do, but it is sort of tinkering around the margins, to the extent the tax code subsidizes expensive mortgages or high property taxes. We can do things to reduce the tax break given to those, which TCGA, one of the most important things it did was just that. You can tie things like community development funds or transportation funds from the federal government to zoning and land use requirements. Again, it's really, I think it's Reihan was getting at is sort of tinkering around the margins, but there may be some things that you can do.
But one of the huge, not to bleed into your subsequent discussions, Avik, but obviously healthcare costs are one of the most egregiously problematic sources of cost of living. Less so if it's employer given, which is true for, I don't know what the figure is. It's 70% of the country, but is a massive drain in terms of, and with very little offsets. And Reihan's totally right about the local dynamic. One thing that, people like me are focusing on in urban areas is that places like San Francisco, New York, LA, less so, Chicago, less so, but Seattle certainly, there was no clear end to that freight train running out of control in terms of costs. In larger cities like New York, you just were pushing more and more people, out to the peripheral, ungentrified areas, and maybe that could have continued for a decade. It's not clear how long that could have gone on for, but it, as a process of urban dynamism, the cost of living spiraling was becoming somewhat untenable, irrespective of COVID, and was likely heading for some reset, either from just a garden variety recession that would have, forced some commercial real estate to have problems. Obviously, that's been hypercharged in COVID land. And there's some, I think, reasons for optimism at the local level about the inequalities there, just organically, right? Because cost of living is basically, you're not making enough money to live where you live, right? This is not a overly complicated formula. And if in a city like New York or San Francisco, where housing could take up, 50 to 65% of after-tax income for a lot of people, it's hard to see any universe where that is healthy or sustainable for the long term. Nor is there an easy policy solution other than prices coming down or incomes going up hugely, right? One of those two things do it. And
Brian, I was just going to, you can respond to Zach. I wanted to ask you a question from the audience to tie into that, which is, how much does land regulation tie into these problems around affordability of whether it's housing or businesses?
Well, Ovik, I want to be respectful of the fact that you're going to have a panel that is entirely about that issue. Certainly, I believe land use regulation is enormously important. It's also a very contentious issue, partly because there are many people for whom they approached major decisions in their lives. They made certain decisions resting on the expectation that certain very sticky land use regulations would remain in place. And so this is a really tough issue to discuss. My own view is that this is an issue where you want to have some kind of consensus, not necessarily at the micro level, but I don't think it's something that you can really decide at the federal level. I think you need to make the case that relaxing land use regulation, more market-oriented land use policy is going to be ultimately beneficial for all parties concerned. It's going to lead to a more prosperous economy, a more inclusive economy for everyone. So that's something I feel pretty strongly about, but again, don't want to kind of belabor that too much. Just to say that, I believe in the law of supply and demand, and I think that it applies in housing as it does in many other domains besides. One brief thing I want to throw out there too, and kind of turning away from land use, but just to kind of really underscore, I think it's hugely important. I do not think there is much room for the federal government to make much of a difference. And in a nationalized political climate, that means that you need different coalitions. You need to get people really energized and focused on the issue, but it's fundamentally a pretty vexing issue. The other thing I wanted to touch on is this question of how we talk about healthcare and the cost of healthcare. And the thing that I want to throw out, and something that you've obviously thought about very deeply, Ovik, but it's just that, for me, one thing I am concerned about and take exception to is, and it's not something that Zach said, by the way, but it's an idea that's in the world, is that the way to address the cost of healthcare is to increase subsidies for medical care at the point of use. And that doesn't make a ton of sense to me, partly because, look, if there are pathologies in the business models in the health sector that are leading to lackluster quality, that's a real problem, and we have to address that, whether or not you're subsidizing, kind of what it is you're paying for. But I also believe that, fundamentally in an affluent society, you expect that as that society ages over time, as people have the kind of material goods that they want and expect, you are going to see more spending on services. This is a big source of stagnant growth in every single advanced market democracy. Just, services, you can see productivity gains, they're less tractable than they are in goods producing services. And medical care is just, the zenith. It is just a paradigmatic example of this. And I guess my own view is that, for me, the issue is less, we're spending a lot of money on healthcare because, if you're an affluent, society, getting from age 83 to 84 to 85 to spend more time with your grandkids means a lot. You're going to spend a lot of money to get there. My concern is whether or not this is going to happen in a politicized context. That is this going to happen, in an environment in which government is calling the shots, and government is also limiting business model innovation, partly in response to political imperatives. It's often said that when you look at what we spend in the US on public health expenditures, it's similar to what some other market democracies spend on all health expenditures. And the sense is that that's a really bad thing. We really should be covering everyone with that amount of money. My view is that, well, no, it's actually a great thing. Spending more, getting more innovation, getting higher quality medical care, that can be a great thing if those public dollars are being used well. And one thing that people don't understand, Ovik, you've been a really articulate, forceful critic of Medicaid and its many deficiencies. But I think it's also the case that when you compare Medicaid to other public insurance systems in a number of other countries, it's actually more comprehensive. Again, that's not to say that it's great, but that's something that's not very well understood about public insurance systems across market democracies. So again, Ovik is smiling because it's something that he, he's forgotten more about this than I'll ever know. So, but I think the broad point is that spending money on healthcare isn't a bad thing if those dollars are going to something that's good and worthwhile, A. B, if those are choices that individuals are making. My concern is that the safety net dollars that we spend are being spread very thin. We're not deploying them in a very thoughtful and careful way. And that's an area where public policy can do a much, much better job. If we spent those dollars more thoughtfully and more carefully, we'd get a lot more out of it to better serve low-income Americans. And also, we would let the rest of the health system work much better as well. Or at least that's my instinct. Again, big subject, but that's my gut.
You know,
Zach,
my take on
before
this
you
is,
answer that question,
okay.
let me hook you up with a question from the audience that's also a subject of great interest to you, which is universal basic income. One thing that obviously there's a lot of interest from the left on, but some interest as well from interesting and creative market-based thinkers is it worth replacing the gamish of welfare policies we have with a universal basic income type system, which could relate to both the subsidy question and the broader efficiency of the system? Go ahead.
And we got in the word gamish. And that question is a perfect tee up to what I was actually going to say in response to Reihan, which was that I think in the United States, Reihan, it's not an issue of how much we spend, it's the way that we spend to deal with both the safety net and the public good part of it. So observationally, the United States spends a huge amount of money on a variety of safety nets.
Which, by the way, is the point that I was trying to make, but please.
Right. And, but we do it really badly in a way that actually makes people end up feeling more insecure, which has always struck me as a terrible use of money and a terrible way to implement a safety net. Like, meaning if you're going to spend too much money and people are going to then feel insecure, you certainly have not achieved your goal from a safety net. And I mean, I know you agree with it. I'm not saying this in contrast to what you're saying, that the issue of healthcare is we do an okay job for the very poor, right? Between Medicaid and other stuff. I mean, you could argue that it's humiliating the way we do it, but we end up doing it. It's the kind of, it's the next tranche, and the affordability and the inequality part becomes the most crushing, right? It's the people who are just above the subsidy level, but below the affordability level. And then we end up spending a lot of money closing that gap somehow, collectively. You know, individual bankruptcies are socially costly in this country, right? You bring other things down with you. If your credit has to get erased or your loans forgiven, that has a ripple effect. Like, so there's no such thing as kind of costless individual bankruptcy from a collective level. And I think that you know, the issue is that the attractive thing about universal basic income as a notion, and what's really interesting about what happened in pandemic land is there is a lot of utility to closing that gap with direct payments rather than erecting bureaucracies that provide indirect and impartial payments. And you know, we don't want to necessarily get into a whole discussion of what's the level of debt and social spending that an economy can bear. I've been arguing for years it is way larger, certainly for the United States, with the dollar as a reserve currency for now and on the advent horizon, that limit is much higher. Therefore, we have more latitude. But I recognize that is a hugely thorny issue. But something has to give in these various equations, and I you know, whether it's healthcare reform, which is not necessarily going to bring down costs, but it might address this issue of, well, what do you do about that group that isn't Medicaid eligible, or for that matter, Medicare eligible, and actually cannot, under any viable terms, afford to purchase that healthcare. And it has hit exactly the people who have been hit hardest by COVID, those service industry workers, those, you know, the Las Vegas casino people who may or may not, depending on their job, if they were working in the kitchens, may not have been getting healthcare. Some were, some weren't. You know, the itinerant workers, the gig workers, all of it. It was fascinating in California, right? Really progressive state, but they totally pushed back on this law about trying to make Uber and Lyft drivers into employees, because it would have been impossible for those companies to provide them all with healthcare, right? It just wouldn't have worked. So, you know, universal basic income may or may not be a feasible thing to solve all these issues, but at least it introduces the reality of you cannot continue as currently construed. It ends up being a massive liability in a healthcare crisis, right? If you don't provide people, if people aren't integrated into the healthcare system, they are much more vulnerable to a pandemic than if they were, and we've seen that, you know, completely. And much more vulnerable to a whole series of other things. So
let's take the question in a sense outside of the pure dollars and cents economics for a minute, because Scott, the theme or the takeaway that you took from your work at the Joint Economic Committee around social capital. You did a lot of really pioneering work trying to identify what are these indicia of social capital, of having, you know, a family or having neighbors that you interact with, things like that. Your takeaway, you did a kind of a tweet storm after you left JEC where you said that my big takeaway from all this is that the real problem is basically the legacy of slavery and segregation and intergenerational Black poverty. Tell us about that and about how you came to that conclusion, if I've characterized it accurately.
Yeah, so I would say I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as the problem. There have been, you know, big social capital declines across the board. You know, Charles Murray's important book, which I'm drawing a blank on. This is not the first time this happened to me. Is essentially Coming Apart. So he wrote this whole book, Coming Apart. That is, you know, 85% of it is about whites, and he shows these big social capital declines for them. And it's true that they've generally been worse for both less educated Americans and for African Americans. What we did at JC was to sort of show one instance where, you know, you can clearly trace historical structural roots for a social capital problem, which is in the southeastern United States, where the map for slavery in 1860 lines up incredibly well with you know, the lowest social capital counties in the United States. So I do think that if something good can come out of 2020, the Black Lives Matters movement, you know, I have a lot of criticisms of myself with the excesses of it. If I had to sort of wave a wand and implement my own agenda to reduce Black-white inequality, you know, policing is not where I would start by any means. But hopefully it can continue a conversation about Black-white inequality, because it really is striking, either if you're talking about social capital, you know, family strength, things like that, or if you're talking about economic mobility. That's really where we failed as policymakers and people interested in policy. If you look at the odds of starting in the bottom fifth as a child and then remaining in the bottom fifth yourself, that ends up being about 50 to 60% of Black men and women that start in the bottom and are stuck there, versus about 25 to 35% of white men and women. If you look at the number of years that kids spend in poverty, 37% of Black kids spend half of their childhoods in poverty versus 5% of white kids. If you look at concentrated poverty, 2/3 of Black kids grow up in neighborhoods with a 30% poverty rate. That compares with 6% of white kids. So there really are just these vast inequalities of opportunity that we don't have to address in a race-specific way by any means. But if we simply asked, you know, what would it take to reduce the most entrenched poverty in the United States, if you're liberal or conservative, if we managed to do that, it would dramatically affect Black-white inequality as well.
Anyone else on thoughts on this issue of intergenerational Black poverty?
One thing I'll observe, and it's actually something that I know Scott has thought about quite a bit, is that when you're thinking about many of our debates around poverty and mobility right now, you do hear hints of this idea that the intergenerational transmission of advantage is a problem. But of course, I'd suggest that most people implicitly believe that the intergenerational transmission of advantage is exactly what good parents and grandparents do. That is what it means to be a virtuous paterfamilias. You know what I mean? That's kind of what it's all about. And I think that this contradiction, people kind of shunt it aside, but I think that it's worth thinking about, well, what does the world look like when we accept that the intergenerational transmission of advantage is a good and healthy thing, but also, hey, we do have entrenched poverty. That's a bad thing. We want to kind of loosen the bottlenecks to opportunity. Because when you think about so much of entrenched poverty, a lot of it, and there's a lot of emerging work on this, work that Scott has engaged with very deeply, is the idea of homophily, the idea of networks, the idea that many opportunities come to you through these extended social ties, And the fact that you have intensely segregated social networks in the case of most Americans. And that's not just about tossing people together in the same apartment building or the same neighborhood. That's about intimacy. That's about kind of these serious social connections that are meaningful social connections. And in a way, there's a way that emphasizing racial differences, heightening the salience of racial differences, it's something that I think feels like, hey, we're taking these issues seriously. But the irony is that can actually make it more difficult to form really kind of intimate social ties across these boundaries. So my sense is that when it comes to addressing these entrenched inequalities, fundamentally, it's something that is going to take a very long time. And if your expectation is that we are going to eliminate all disparities next week, or we're a gravely unjust society, that's going to be a recipe for a lot of frustration. But if you think of it instead as, look, this is a very complex process with a lot of different interrelated processes, there are a lot of ways we can move to a kind of healthier state of affairs, I think we'd be in better shape. The other thing to keep in mind, there are a couple of economists, Natasha Sarin, Sylvain Catherine, have done some really neat work on how we think about wealth inequality. So, many of you will have observed that we've gone from really talking about income inequality to talking about wealth inequality. And the problem with talking about wealth inequality is that many of the transfer programs we've adopted over the course of many decades effectively serve as substitutes for wealth. The paradigmatic example, the one where there's been a lot of spade work intellectually, is Social Security. Social Security, it essentially gives you a kind of annuity, right? That's why people built up wealth over time. And there's kind of, old canonical economic research about how this served as a substitute for savings. China is a good example of a society where you have a very weak safety net right now, and you have households making very modest incomes that accumulate huge amounts of savings, right? You could say that's good or bad, let's leave that aside. But if you're talking about wealth inequality without acknowledging that these transfer programs that serve as substitutes for wealth exist, you get into this crazy circular conversation where then you introduce new safety net programs. Oh, wait, wealth inequality is even worse. We need more programs that serve as substitutes for wealth. So I'm not saying that we don't have serious inequalities that we need to address, but when you think about groups that came into American society or where barriers to their advancement started to be dismantled around the same time, we created these programs as substitutes for wealth, then you get into this tricky territory, right? Because one way to think about enduring racial and ethnic inequalities is if you live in a stable, peaceful society and you don't experience military conquest or other violent disruption, there's going to be a compounding effect of wealth. If you only got to be a part of that wealth building process later on historically, and if, by the way, on top of that, we did all sorts of really well-intentioned things to serve as substitutes for wealth building, you're going to see a kind of complicated picture. So again, I'm not saying therefore everything's hunky-dory, but I am saying that we need to think about what do those processes of wealth accumulation look like when we accept that the transmission of intergenerational advantage is legitimate and indeed a good thing.
Yeah,
One thing I want to go ahead, Zach.
Reihan, you could inadvertently use half of your argument as a defense of reparations for African Americans over time.
Longer story, but I don't think of it that way. But,
no, I'm relatively certain that you don't.
We should do a whole panel on that topic. That would be an interesting one. Go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to say, so a couple things. So I think Reihan's thinking about what I'll call relative mobility has really forced me to think harder about it too. And essentially, like, the idea of relative mobility is your initial rank doesn't determine your subsequent rank. And I think Reihan's very smart objection to people who say, like, we need more relative mobility is, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but I've quoted it a few times. It's mostly right. A world with perfect relative mobility is a world where no matter what you do for your kid, how much you invest in them, they basically where they end up is a coin flip, which sounds unattractive. I will admit. Another way to think about it, though, is what if we could get all kids, regardless of their background, on an equal playing field by the time they start kindergarten? Well, in that case, there would be a lot of people, a lot of parents that would have to work harder for their kids who otherwise would have been advantaged to remain sort of on top. And so they're going to work harder. Potentially the parents of the kids that we've moved up to the starting line are also going to work harder. So you could end up with this virtuous circle where everybody's working harder to make sure their kids end up at the top. And it is going to be, in the extreme, it ends up something like a coin flip who actually gets there. But in the process, we've increased everybody's skill levels. We've increased economic growth. Everybody's better off in absolute terms over time. And we have better relative mobility. That's an extreme example, but I think that's sort of the more appealing version of how we could have more relative mobility than sort of like whatever you do, it's all for naught.
Avik, sorry, go on.
Oh,
Yeah,
no, I was
go
going to
ahead,
say, and there are better and worse ways to do it for sure. I would never advocate sort of direct redistribution or expanding the safety net as a way to get that greater upward mobility.
So I'm actually going to address this question that showed up in the chat as a way of also advancing this, because education has clearly been perceived in the United States, at least, as a primary mode of changing that mobility pattern, right? And there was a question in the chat about escalating higher education costs and that making it more untenable for people on rising levels of debt. I think there's been a distortion of several problems and then calling it a student debt problem. It's certainly true that four-year college education, both public and private, has escalated massively ahead of inflation over the past 30 years. It is not true that the student debt problem is fundamentally one of four-year public and private schools. The student debt problem is primarily a product of either two-year schools or for-profit schools or professional schools, particularly two-year schools, people trying to get an associate's degree in their mid-20s, often racial minorities, who then take on loans and never actually finish the degree. So they're saddled with loans without a degree for a degree that they were only getting in order to get a higher salary to be able to pay off the cost of that education. Or it's, the dentist with $140,000 of loans because there's not a lot of aid for that. The problem is there's a perception, legitimately in the elitism of some of these schools about who gets admitted, but the story that has gotten told around this is a real problem because it's not really that true factually, right? Most student debt burdens for four-year schools are around 17, maybe it may have gotten up to $20,000, which can seem a lot if you say it, oh my God, to someone who's 18 years old. But the whole point of going to a four-year school is that your average income over the course of your life ends up being $50,000 or $55,000. And so paying that off over a few years, presumably before you buy your first home, is by any means, if there's good times to take on debt to augment future earnings, that's one of the few areas where debt is both defensible and it would seem to have economic validity.
Let me stop you there, Zach, because
yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Wrap it up.
Anyway, I'm just saying the
up.
story of crisis, and there is a crisis in the economic model of higher education from the perspective of the universities, which online education and COVID has, I think, exposed in ways that is going to have massive ripple effects in higher education. But that's different than those being unavailable to people.
We got just a minute or two here. I want to ask Reihan. I know one of the most interesting things I've read of yours that I cite all the time is you wrote once about, and maybe you've written repeatedly about, the rising power of the nonprofit sector in our economy and how that's driving up the cost of not just higher education, healthcare, a lot of other things. Can you just touch on that in the minute or two we have left?
Avik, I'm sorry, I can't really address it in a minute or two. What I will say is that nonprofits, like the ones that we represent, are a critically important part of a healthy civil society and democracy, and they're amazing. So please don't think that. But just broadly, the core point of it was just this idea that you have organizations that are oftentimes pretty opaque, and where it's not clear who is actually governing them. So if you think about the model of university, is the faculty in charge? Is the administration in charge? Similarly with hospitals, you have a lot of organizations that have their origins in an earlier historical moment when they were not really professionalized, they were not receiving the same kind of public subsidies they receive now, and where you see a kind of deep dysfunction. So I think that is likely a big part of what I had in mind. Big swaths of the economy are in the hands of nonprofits that are not really doing what it is they initially set out to do, and their structure hasn't been appropriately modernized to meet those new challenges. But that's part of why, and being serious for a moment, you see in the emergence of new organizations that are better suited to the needs of the moment. And I think that that's a natural and healthy process. But there certainly are real pathologies. Avik, I'd like to ask you to explain to me all of American history, and particularly the dilemma of race, in the next 30 seconds.
Well, I wish I could type out a URL, but actually, a book is on my Kindle right now that I'm going to read on my commute after I'm done with election-related stuff is The New Jim Crow, which I think is going to be illuminating on some of these topics. Well, listen, guys, we could go on for hours, but I promised you that I'd let you go at 4:30.
I could disagree with you about that one for hours, Avik, but yeah. Please.
Okay, that's fine. Well, that's what I want to learn. I want to learn from people who I may or may not agree with, but that's kind of what I try to do with my reading. Thanks again to all of you. I mean, again, it's a busy time right now, so I know you all are very busy. So thanks for your time. Thanks to the audience for the great questions. Our next Agenda 2025 panel discussion will be next Tuesday at the same time, 3:30 Eastern. The link you used to log into this one will also be good for that one. You can see the whole agenda and schedule at agenda.freeop.org. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.